Just as the turmoil of 2020 was coming to a close, developments broke in the Andre Hill case. On December 31st, CNN reported on Amy Detweiler's version of the story. Detweiler is the officer who had witnessed Andre Hill getting shot. She said that Coy did yell out, quote, "There's a gun in his other hand. There's a gun in his other hand," before shooting Andre. Lathan Lipman, Detweiler's attorney, tried to tell the media that she was not responsible for providing Hill with first aid because she was not provided with first aid training. Quote, "Without the necessary training and medical equipment, officers, including those on scene for this incident, cannot effectively render aid. Without the proper training, officers risk causing greater harm." Ginther and Quinlan quickly refuted this, saying officers are absolutely given first aid training, and it's inexcusable that so many officers failed to render aid. Ginther said, quote, "I am horrified by the time that passed before any officer provided aid to Mr. Hill. Our officers are trained to provide potentially life-saving care, and at the very least comfort in these situations." Quinlan assured the media right away that all officers would be held accountable. Quote, "As a police chief, and just as a human being, the events of the last week have left me shaken and heartbroken for the family of Andre Hill. We will not tolerate a repeat of these failures, and where officers failed, they will be held accountable." Some of Hill's family members spoke with the media for the first time during this CNN interview. Andre had been a father and grandfather, and he was very close with his family. Andre Hill's brother, Alvin Williams, talked about the lack of first aid given to Hill. Quote, "Nobody had any type of human emotion or sympathy for this dying man, gasping for his last breaths. And then you detain him worse than a caged animal? Not only for Columbus, Ohio. I'm saying this for all the police forces across this land. Your hunting season is over." Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. The next day, January 1st, around 5 minutes before midnight, someone fired a gun at Casey Goodson's family home. The shot closely missed one of Casey's little brothers. Tamala was worried that it might have had something to do with the investigation. She told the press, quote, "We celebrated Christmas without Casey, but Jason Meade was home with his family. We tried to celebrate the New Year missing Casey, and we were attacked in our home while Jason Meade was safe at home with his family. Whatever their intent was, I want everyone to know that we are unafraid and undeterred in our pursuit of justice for Casey." Local law enforcement released statements reminding the public that it's not uncommon for guns to be fired on New Year's, and that it may have been a coincidence. There were 13 other houses and buildings hit with bullets that day, and over 300 reported gunshots, when normally there are about 10 per day in Columbus. Sean Walton assured the public that if it was an act of intimidation, law enforcement was investigating it thoroughly, and said, quote, "We intend to do everything within our power to keep this family safe from further harm or intimidation, and regardless of this act of aggression against them, we will be continuing to fight for justice for Casey Goodson." On January 5th, Andre Hill was laid to rest. Bishop Timothy Clark was present at his funeral as well, alongside civil rights activist Al Sharpton. NBC had announced they would have reporters there, but very little about Andre Hill's funeral made it into the news. This is because of the post-election protests at the U.S. Capitol that happened the next day on January 6th. NBC bumped the funeral coverage, and the Dispatch stopped following the local story for a bit in light of the unprecedented events that unfolded in Washington, D.C. For days afterward, the events at the Capitol dominated the news cycle, and Andre and Casey's stories, as well as Black Lives Matter stories in general, fell out of the public eye. On January 14th, the People's Justice Project announced that they were canceling their planned protests for the weekend. They'd been planning the protests to coincide with Martin Luther King Jr. Day and we're going to spotlight the recent deaths in Columbus. But alt-right, pro-Trump protesters announced they would be protesting the election that weekend, and that they would be heavily armed. Activist Jenny Vaughts said, quote, "We don't want to risk anyone's life. We don't want to put a spotlight on them. We don't want to engage in combat." The city of Columbus was planning on the possibility of the protests becoming violent, and it closed all state buildings in downtown. Vaughts said the organizers were disappointed they wouldn't be able to speak out on the weekend before MLK Day, but it was to protect everyone's safety. He said, quote, "We're very sad about losing this opportunity to celebrate King's accomplishments, as we're in the midst of objecting to all the killings of black men that have happened here." On January 16th, the newly elected Franklin County prosecutor, Gary Tyack, issued a statement to the media in order to ease local law enforcement's concerns that he did not respect them. He told the Dispatch that, quote, "For years and years, some police have felt they had immunity as long as they told a story about how they shot someone in self-defense. I'm sorry, we can't let officers keep getting away with that." This caused the Fraternal Order of Police to speak out against Tyack. Keith Farrell, a president of one of the FOP lodges, said, quote, "I think it's dangerous for the public if we're making those kinds of statements and we're not following the rule of law. Our position is the law is the law and the facts are the facts." In response to this, Tyack said, quote, "I want to acknowledge that law enforcement provides an important service to our community. I appreciate the work performed by law enforcement officers." He said that his earlier comments were directed at law enforcement officers who themselves are not following the rule of law. And he went on to say that activists and law enforcement need to work together to bring about change. Quote, "We must heed those calls for justice across the country and assure our communities, especially our communities of color, that thorough, transparent, and fair investigations will be conducted into such matters, and that any prosecution will be fair and balanced. We cannot ignore cries for justice, nor can we let our law enforcement officers believe that they are not supported." On January 18th, many of the traditional celebrations for Martin Luther King Jr. Day were held virtually due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Guest speakers and civil rights leaders discussed issues that King had fought for that are still pervasive today, and remembered the protests that had happened in the past. The Columbus Dispatch interviewed local activists who had been protesting in not only the recent protests, but who participated over the summer. Charlie Stewart, who works with the Black, Queer, and Intersection Collective, said, quote, "I think it's important for organizers and freedom fighters to reflect on what our ancestors did, what they were trying to tell the world. We like to try to reflect on what they were telling us. What is still relevant today? Most of it is." In late January, Police Chief Thomas Quinlan stepped down as chief. Quinlan had always been vocal about supporting activists, but many said he didn't do enough to prevent violence. During the summer protests, Quinlan had joined in on a few marches, but received criticism for waiting until the protests had largely died down, meaning he wasn't really in danger from being pepper sprayed or shot with rubber bullets, like the earlier protesters had dealt with. His participation in the protests seemed to reflect what the public thought of him in general. He seemed to support change and wasn't afraid to call for Coy to be fired, but he was too cautious. He was trying to please everyone and was too hesitant to call out corruption. Mayor Ginther said, quote, "It became clear to me that Chief Quinlan could not successfully implement the reform and change I expect, and that the community demands. Columbus residents have lost faith in him and in Division's ability to change on its own. Chief Quinlan understood. He agreed to step back so the city can move forward. I appreciate Chief Quinlan's service to the community and the changes he was able to implement in his time as chief." Ginther went on to say that the city was working hard to bring about reform. The Civilian Review Board was about to be officially implemented, and the city had invested a good deal of money into non-police safety initiatives. This included mental health professionals adept at dealing with crises and social workers who could be sent out in non-emergency situations that would normally be handled by the police. During his resignation, Quinlan said, quote, "The opportunity to serve as your chief of police has been the honor of my career. While I very much hope to continue in that role, I respect the safety director's decision and the community's need to go in a different direction. We accomplished a lot in my time as chief. We implemented dozens of reforms geared toward accountability, transparency, and strengthening public trust. Someone else will now carry those priorities forward, and I will help and support them in any way I can. In my 3 decades of service to Columbus, my commitment has never been to any title or position. It has been to this division and this community I love. That will not change." During his term, Quinlan had helped fight for some of the changes Ginther mentioned, and had notably shut down the corrupt vice unit that had numerous sexual assault scandals throughout the years. On January 30th, a crowd of over 200 people gathered at Goodale Park to celebrate what would have been Casey Goodson's 24th birthday. The crowd stood far apart to comply with social distancing recommendations. They listened to guest speakers and made a display of the 36 people killed by CPD in the last 40 years. They then marched through the Short North District and told the media they were calling for the arrest of Jason Meade, as well as the resignation of Sheriff Baldwin. On February 1st, the Columbus City Council passed Andre's Law, which requires officers to turn on body cameras during confrontations and to render first aid immediately to suspects or face legal consequences. On Wednesday, February 3rd, Adam Coy was indicted for 1 count of murder and 2 counts of dereliction of duty. He spent the next few days in jail awaiting trial. Once the verdict was announced, David Yost said, quote, "Police undertake the increasingly difficult and dangerous task of protecting our communities, but every person is responsible for and judged by his or her own actions. Neither guilt nor virtue may be assumed by association. The grand jury found the truth. Andre Hill should not be dead." The consensus among citizens and Andre Hill's family was that the indictment was a good step in the right direction, but it didn't necessarily guarantee justice. Michael Wright said, quote, "We're happy that the indictment has occurred, but this is a first step. We want the officer to be convicted. We want him to be incarcerated." After the hearing, Andre Hill's legal team spoke to the press. Ben Crump told the media the disturbing news that the independent autopsy conducted had determined that if Andre Hill had been given first aid after being shot, he may have actually survived. On February 6th, Adam Coy went to court again, and his attorney, Mark Collins, the same attorney representing Jason Meade, told the court that Coy had actually interacted with Hill before the shooting. Coy had actually responded alone. The other officer seen in the body cam footage, Amy Detweiler, had arrived shortly after as backup. According to Collins, when Coy arrived on the scene, quote, "He had an initial interaction with Mr. Hill, when Mr. Hill was in his car, and some things didn't make sense." Hill had been in the car, and during their interaction, he got out of the vehicle and started walking toward the house, at which point Coy, quote, "gave Mr. Hill a verbal command of what to do, and then Mr. Hill did not respond." Coy then waited for backup, and Detweiler arrived shortly after. At this point, Andre was in the garage. Collins said that Coy was concerned Hill was involved in a burglary, and said that Coy was thinking, quote, "there was some sort of burglary potentially going on, or what have you." His thought process was, let's go behind the house and see. Is someone handing stuff out of the house? Is there someone running away? Is he warning someone? What Coy said to Detweiler is unclear, but he didn't inform her that he thought Hill was dangerous. Then they walk up the driveway, and what we saw on the body cam footage ensued. Collins claimed that Coy thought the key ring in Andre's hand was a silver revolver. Coy was given a $3 million bond. Collins then argued for the bond to be lowered, saying, quote, "Even the officer on George Floyd was given a $1 million bond, and this is nothing like that in any way, shape, or form." During the hearing, a small group of protesters demonstrated outside the courthouse. They held up signs that read, "Justice for Andre," and chanted Andre and Casey's names, as well as others who have been killed by the police in recent years. Once the hearing ended, Andre Hill and Casey Goodson's families and legal teams gathered in front of the protesters to speak. The families exchanged hugs, and their respective legal teams gave statements. Michael Wright, working for the Hill family, said, quote, "We have to absolutely stand up and support one another. Make sure we have laws enacted. Make sure that all these officers are convicted such that they will think twice before pulling out their gun and applying lethal force on folks that doesn't need to happen to." Sean Walton, with the Goodson family, said, quote, "We've been left with no choice but to stand together in moments such as this to speak up and speak out against a system that's been designed to protect the police more than the people." On February 10th, Sean Walton announced that Tamala and he had spoken with the Franklin County coroner, who confirmed that Casey was shot in the back 6 times. They had shown her pictures of Casey's body and confirmed that he had been shot with a high-powered rifle. The private medical examiner that she'd hired had even shown her pictures of Casey's body. Tamala thought about releasing pictures of Casey's body to the media, as they would likely be released during the trial anyway, and Casey's family felt as though his case was at a standstill. Sheriff Baldwin was quick to issue a statement, saying they were still waiting for the official report. Quote, "Like everyone in our community, I want answers about Casey Goodson's death as soon as possible. However, we don't know what the Franklin County coroner may have said, and the information relayed by Miss Payne doesn't have all of the facts needed to give us those answers." He said that there may be other crucial information missing and urged people not to jump to conclusions. After the family unofficially released Casey's autopsy results, journalist Andy Downing interviewed several of Casey's friends and family members for an article about his life. It ran on January 25th for both Columbus Alive and the Columbus Dispatch. The article talked a lot about Casey's relationship with his grandparents. His grandmother said, quote, "I saw him after he was shot, and I still wake up in the night crying. It's something that will be with me for the rest of my life." She hadn't been able to return home recently due to health concerns, but talked about wanting to go back home, to the house where she had helped raise Casey, because all of the good childhood memories had not been tainted by the fact that the house was also where he died. Casey's grandfather had been like a father to him. Casey had become interested in working with cars and motorcycles from following his grandfather around while he worked as an auto mechanic. He looked up to him as the man of the house. But when Casey's grandfather's health started failing in 2018, Casey was devastated. He would spend time holding his grandfather's hand while he laid in bed, and didn't want to hear the details of his doctor's visits, as it was too hard for him. Eventually, his grandfather passed, and though Casey was devastated, he quickly decided to take on the role of family protector. He started checking in on his siblings more, and even giving them a talking to when they misbehaved. And that had been his grandfather's job. His sister Céilí said he would always text her when she was out to see if she needed a ride and to see if she felt safe with the people she was with. She said, quote, "I have messages and messages of him asking me, 'Where are you? Are you okay? What are you doing?' He was really protective." This was also the time when Casey became interested in gun ownership. His grandfather had always kept a gun in the house to protect the family, so Casey wanted to learn to keep that same responsibility. He opted for a concealed carry license so he could keep a gun with him on the road as well, since he traveled alone and truck stops could be dangerous. As if there wasn't enough evidence already to point to it being unlikely that Casey would just go around waving a gun, a few more of Casey's friends chimed in during this article about his passion for gun safety. After he got his license, Goodson's friend Vern Christian recalled Casey lecturing him about gun safety, and being especially conscious of it as a black man. Quote, "He'd be over here telling me to carry safely, telling me about gun laws, telling me the warnings of being a black man with the CCW. The two also discussed police violence during the summer protests and talked about how they both felt that, quote, as a black man, it's super scary when we see a police officer, even if we have nothing to do with anything." Casey was careful and only kept a gun as protection. At the same time this episode was written, CPD still won't confirm if Casey even had his gun on him or if it was just in the car. But either way, the fact that he owned one gave Jason Mead some kind of credibility to his story that complicates the investigation. But even if Casey had been waving a gun around, he couldn't have been pointing it at Mead when he was killed if the family was right and he was shot in the back. And in mid-March, the family's statements were officially confirmed that Casey had been shot in the back 6 times. Toxicology reports found small traces of nicotine and cannabinoids in his system, but no drug use. Other than that, there wasn't too much new information aside from what Tamala had already gone public with. She said the autopsy confirms Casey was murdered. Quote, "This report says it right here. Jason Mead murdered my son in his own home." When the media tried to get a hold of Mark Collins for comment on the autopsy report, he apparently had not read it yet and said, quote, "We cannot comment on something that we have not seen. It would be reckless and ignorant." Sheriff Baldwin released a similar statement to his previous one, saying the report alone would not provide all the answers, and that eyewitness accounts and other evidence needed to be taken into account. Mayor Ginther told the public that the prosecutors could now move forward with the investigation. Quote, "It's time for a grand jury to examine the evidence and move toward justice and accountability in this tragic death." With Adam Coy facing trial for murder and the promise that the Goodson case was underway, the cases faded from the spotlight, both local and national. Protests died down as both families seemed satisfied with the way things were going, and Columbus was actually making big steps toward police reform. But on April 13th, another black citizen was killed by Columbus police. Miles Jackson died during an exchange of gunfire at Mount Carmel St. Anne's Medical Center. In response, a crowd of about 50 gathered to protest. They decided to start their march close to the hospital and walk to St. Anne's. Hannah Abdur-Rahim led the crowd to the hospital parking lot, where they chanted and yelled at police. Though people were upset, the protests stayed peaceful. The next night, however, there was more of a crowd, and though details were emerging about what had happened with Miles Jackson, many of the citizens of Columbus had lost faith that CPD was telling the truth. According to them, Jackson had an outstanding warrant that police discovered as he was having a medical emergency. So they escorted the ambulance to the hospital with the intent to arrest him once he had been treated. But Jackson had somehow smuggled a gun into the hospital and fired first after being told multiple times to drop his weapon. But the body cam footage had yet to be released, and even those that believed the story argued that CPD needed to learn better de-escalation tactics, because so many encounters had been ending in fatalities. Protesters that night started their demonstrations downtown. They marched to the State House to chant the names of those who had been lost to police violence, including Dwayne Wright, who had recently been killed during a traffic stop in Minnesota. They then marched to CPD headquarters. They attempted to get inside, but police had locked up the outside door with handcuffs. The crowd broke through, and people started pouring into the front doors. OSU student Hunter Matten struck one of the police officers trying to keep them out with a club, and police used pepper spray to get the crowd out. This spurred Ginther to say that while he supported the protests, quote, "Let me be clear, violence and destruction will not be tolerated." The protesters gathered the following night, bringing out the "Columbus is not safe for black people" sign once again. During this time, protesters told the awaiting media that CPD's account of what had happened was not true. It was a small group that wanted to do a sit-in inside police headquarters. But when they saw the handcuffs, they came off easily when one protester tried opening the door a few times. Additional details emerged as CPD released a more detailed statement. The officer struck in the face was actually Justin Coleman, the son of former Mayor Michael Coleman, and he only had minor injuries. They also said they would be investigating whether the use of mace was justified. Meanwhile, the footage of Miles Jackson's death was released, and those who had doubted that he shot first were provided with proof. But that didn't stop the protests. His death had rallied the BLM organizers together, and many were still skeptical that it was justified. The crowd remained peaceful, but demanded that Hunter Matten be released from jail, and also called for Jason Meade to be arrested and for Dallas Baldwin to be fired. They then had a 10-minute sit-in outside the front doors of police headquarters to remember the nearly 10 minutes it had taken for George Floyd to die. The protest continued on Saturday the 18th and was organized by Kiara Yakita. She's organized many of the protests since the summer and said, quote, "We did all of that demonstrating last year, and clearly they haven't learned. They don't care. There's no empathy and there's no attempt at improvement. So here we are again, with even more murders." The crowd chanted the familiar chant of, quote, "All cops are bastards," that has been echoing across city streets since the summer protests, as well as, quote, "No justice, no peace." In addition to the usual Black Lives Matter signs, they had one on display that said, quote, "The whole damn system is guilty as hell." Hannah Abdur-Rahim spoke a bit about Miles Jackson. She pointed out that yes, he did have a gun and he was shooting, but there are numerous white mass shooters and domestic terrorists who are taken alive, and it shows a disparity in the system that Miles Jackson was killed while just recently mass shooter Kyle Rittenhouse was taken alive while he still had his AR-15. In the past few months, local coverage had been more open to quoting activists with more extreme views. They interviewed people who wanted the entire law enforcement system dismantled, and people calling for defunding of the police. When previously, the news had somewhat leaned toward only quoting more palatable views to a wide audience. But as the year wore on, the news became more open. In fact, Hannah Abdur-Rahim has shown up in numerous local articles all year, but it was only in April that the papers mentioned she was an organizer for the Black Abolitionist Collective. Many protesters on the 18th spoke with the media about how they were protesting for not just recent events, but the systemic problems that Black people have been facing for generations. Professor Ashley M. Howard said, quote, "The fact that in so many different places, over so many different years, we see Black people upset about the same things shows that this is a structural and systemic phenomenon. The police incident is just the catalyst, but these are grievances that the Black community has had for decades, and really, generationally." The police helicopter that circled overhead while all of this was going on came under fire the next day for taking a joyride. The helicopter fleet has already been criticized as being larger than it needs to be, and people have proposed reducing it as it costs over $700,000 to maintain annually. Despite these criticisms and the promises from CPD to do better in light of recent protests, on April 18th, the helicopter pilot running their daily route took a joyride. He spelled out the letters CPD over the neighborhood of Whitehall, a primarily Black neighborhood, and citizens who follow the police flight plan immediately noticed and posted the flight path to social media. CPD was quick to release a statement that the joyride was still over their normal flight path and didn't use up any additional fuel, but they would be investigating as it was unprofessional. Following this incident, many citizens who wouldn't normally look at the usual flight path quickly noticed something disturbing. The normal CPD flight path covers less than 1/4 of the city, and when compared with a demographics map, it covers exclusively Black neighborhoods. CPD's regular patrol route ignores the majority of the city and patrols just the Black neighborhoods on a daily basis. 2 days later, on April 20th, the United States watched in anticipation of the verdict on the George Floyd trial. Derek Chauvin was found guilty, and the country celebrated. The Columbus Dispatch interviewed representatives and leaders about the verdict, and City Council Representative Shannon Hardin said, quote, "Today's guilty verdict doesn't bring back George Floyd. It doesn't bring back Andre Hill, Casey Goodson Jr., or those killed by law enforcement across our nation. But it does give us hope for accountability and better policing in the future." The bridges of trust are tenuous. However, we can rebuild them to ensure safety in all our neighborhoods. While this moment of accountability is a critical step in the march for equal justice, it doesn't prevent the next unnecessary shooting or use of force. Unfortunately, even before the verdict was read, the next black life had been unnecessarily snuffed out right here in Columbus. Just minutes before the guilty verdict was read in the Floyd case, 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant was shot and killed on the East Side. As people all across the country celebrated a victory towards racial justice, Ma'Khia's family and friends received word of her death. Columbus police were quick to share the details and body camera footage, because Ma'Khia had been in a fight at the time she was killed, and there was footage of her swinging a knife at another girl, which is when Officer Nicholas Reardon shot her 4 times. The fight stopped, and Reardon tried to render first aid, but she passed soon after. Because of the timing with the George Floyd verdict, Ma'Khia Bryant's death made national news. Like with Miles Jackson, many acknowledged that yes, she had been armed, but surely she could have been tased or shot only once. They argued that shooting to kill should not be the knee-jerk reaction of police officers. Celebrities took to Twitter to call for justice, including LeBron James, Halsey, and Oprah. Her death brought the spotlight back to Columbus. The New York Times and other widely read publications started talking about not only her, but the ongoing trial of Adam Coy and the investigation into Casey Goodson's death. In the days that followed, as Adam Coy's trial was brought back into the spotlight and people all across the country were learning Casey Goodson's name for the first time, more details emerged about Ma'Khia Bryant. The women that Ma'Khia had been attacking had been in their mid-20s, and they'd actually started the fight. They came to Ma'Khia's foster home and started an argument about the girls not keeping up on the house chores. This quickly spiraled out of control, and someone from inside the house, either Ma'Khia or her sister, it is still unclear, called 911. They asked for help because, quote, grown women were trying to stab them and lay hands on them. So Ma'Khia did have a knife, but she was defending herself and her little sister, and within a minute of police arriving, they shot her. No attempt at negotiation was made. Unlike in other cases, though, the officer had shot her to try and save someone else's life, and his actions were deemed acceptable, according to police training. But it opened up the conversation about overhauling tactics and teaching de-escalation, something that is frequently brought up in these cases with little success so far. Ma'Khia's case was quickly commented on by the White House. Press Secretary Jen Psaki told the media, quote, "The killing of 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant by the Columbus police is tragic. She was a child. We're thinking of her friends and family in the communities that are hurting and grieving her loss." On April 30th, Ma'Khia was laid to rest at the First Church of God on Refugee Road, the same church where Andre Hill and Casey Goodson had their funerals. Her principal awarded her an honorary diploma, and the media largely gave the family privacy. The days following her death, her loved ones emphasized that she was a child and needed to be treated like one in the media. Oftentimes, black teenagers are treated like adults, so her friends told the media about how her favorite color was blue and how she liked to watch TikTok videos, and about how she wanted to be a cosmetologist. During one of the early protests about her death, participants all wore colorful Crocs because that had been her favorite type of shoe. On May 1st, Ma'Khia's mother, Paula Bryant, joined in on one of the rallies about her daughter. This time, the protesters were wearing butterfly hair clips, which Ma'Khia had an affinity for. Paula's lawyer, Michelle Marin, told the crowd, quote, "I want to give Miss Bryant the opportunity to share with you all who Ma'Khia is and was, so that you can take that narrative back. Because as they continue to villainize our babies, we have to really tell their stories. We have to tell who our children are. We have to keep them as children." Paula told the crowd that, quote, "She had a beautiful smile, was loving, and had a beautiful personality. She was a protector and had a motherly spirit about her. Paula had been separated from Ma'Khia for some time, as Ma'Khia had been living with a foster family at the time of her death, and both her mother and foster mother spoke with the media to help spread her story. Ever since December, graffiti and signs over highway bridges have been popping up all around Columbus that say, "Justice for Casey," "Justice for Andre," or "Arrest Jason Meade," but almost all of them had been painted over or taken down by April. But after the protests for Ma'Khia Bryant on May 1st, signs started appearing all over the city again. But this time with, quote, "Say her name," and "Justice for Ma'Khia" as well. Ma'Khia's story is still making front-page news with new developments. Adam Coy has been indicted, but has not yet gone to trial and may not for some time. Jason Meade is still a free man, and no timeline of Casey Goodson's investigation has been made public. It could be years before either of these cases are solved. However, the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor have brought attention and awareness to the Black Lives Matter movement in a way that's never happened before. And Ma'Khia Bryant's death has brought national attention to the racial injustice in Columbus. So whatever happens with Adam Coy and Jason Meade, the people of Columbus can at least rest assured that now the whole country will be watching. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include the Columbus Dispatch and NBC4. For a full list of sources, as well as links to our sponsors and contributors, please see our show notes. Please rate or review on your chosen app and follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.